Borderlands, directed by Eli Roth, stars Cate Blanchett, Kevin Hart, Jack Black, and Jamie Lee Curtis. The movie follows a ragtag team of misfits who embark on a mission to save a missing girl who holds the key to unimaginable power. I'll be the first to admit I have very limited knowledge on the Borderlands games. I've only ever played a bit of the second game until at one point I got stuck in a boss fight and I just haven't bothered to pick up the game since. However, the part of the game I did play, I do remember enjoying. So when I heard Eli Roth, of all people, was going to be directing this movie adaptation of the game, I was a little skeptical, mainly due to the track record both video game movies have had in the past and the reputation Roth has gathered as a director. Although both of these reasons have surpassed expectations, as recently we've gotten somewhat decent adaptations of video games, specifically the newest Mario movie, and I've gotten a little bit of respect for Eli Roth after I really enjoyed last year's Thanksgiving, which I did a review for that you can watch on the channel. So I did end up going into this movie with an open mind, but how did I feel coming out of the movie? I'll start by talking about the performances. Firstly, with Cate Blanchett, I do think she's at least trying in this movie with the material she's given. She tries as much as she can to add her usual charisma into the role, and sometimes it does shine through, but at the same time, I think it does get neutralized by the screenplay. If anything, I do think as an actress, she's way too good for this movie. Like, it feels so weird to see her go from being in a film like Tar to this. It is the standard thing of being a team leader that any other person could have filled the role of doing, and I don't want to go as far as to saying she carried the movie through her performance though. I think the best way I can describe it is she's doing the best she can with what she's given with, and now the odd occasion it pays off, but it really isn't enough to make her the absolute standout here. Kevin Hart plays Kevin Hart in this movie. Many fans of the games were annoyed by his casting, mainly due to the ongoing problem that Hart always makes to be the butt of most of his jokes, that he wasn't as tall as his video game counterpart. However, this aspect didn't bother me, as I don't have a big attachment to the character. In the past few years though, it seems that Kevin Hart wants to be painted more as an action star. We saw this crash and burn only earlier in the year with the movie on Netflix called Lillith, and it continues here as he mainly portrays himself to be a badass gun toter, while at the same time still being one of the comic reliefs in the movie. I think a lot of the time he just says some of the most corniest, shoehorned in leadership lines that always feel like they were manufactured in a factory, and whenever he delivers these lines it never feels genuine and at the same time never feels incredibly believable. I think I still just don't buy Kevin Hart as an action star. I think it doesn't help the fact that he isn't playing a character here. He really is just Kevin Hart in a shitty Borderlands cosplay to the point where it almost feels like parody. He's just not that good here either. He didn't do enough to make me care about whatever arc he had in this too. Jack Black in this is doing a slightly sillier voice than usual, providing the voice of the character Claptrap. This character in the games I am more familiar with, as he is supposed to act as the main comic relief in those games, but at the same time it's meant to irritate the characters within the games, basically always being joked at his own expense in these games. So yes, this movie did get an aspect of that part of his character right by annoying characters in the movie, and surprisingly it didn't come off as too annoying to a certain extent. I think the main thing that annoyed me, which I'm also sad to report, is that Jack Black just isn't funny in the slightest here. I went to see this movie, and while the cinema wasn't full, there was still a sizable amount of people in the movie theater, and it's probably the first time I've never heard a single person laugh at anything he says here, which is totally warranted because nothing he says or does in this movie is funny in the slightest. There's literally a point in the movie where the whole movie stops for probably a whole minute or two, where we are subjected to watching his character just shit all over the ground. I think that moment is the perfect amalgamation of what this movie represents, basically. I was surprised, however, watching the movie in full, as the advertisements made it seem like his character was going to be more cringe than anything, but I didn't think those moments came true in the final product, which was a relief to see, but it still sucks that this is probably the first time in a long time I've seen Jack Black not be funny. Hopefully he brings a better performance in the Minecraft movie. You'd hope he would put more effort into voice acting for video game movies, since it looks like he'd rather do that than standing by someone he's been friends with for so many years. Jamie Lee Curtis plays a scientist lady in this, which obviously is another character from the games, and I thought she was one of the better characters here. Her performance is pretty endearing and charming for a lot of the time she's on screen, and while she doesn't also save the movie completely, it was definitely more bearable when her character was on screen. Acts as another comic relief. I swear this movie suffers from Marvel syndrome, where every single character on team is the comic relief and there's no variety between any of them besides some changes in their personalities. But when every character is a comic relief, does it really mean in the end anything these people say actually end up being funny? Ariana Greenblatt plays Tiny Tina in this movie, another pretty infamous character from the games. I'm gonna give a pretty brave take and say I've yet to actually fully enjoy a performance from this actress. I thought her character was written to be extremely insufferable, almost on purpose looking back on it in the movie Barbie, and it's not much different here. She is pretty annoying for most of the time when she's on screen. I'm just thankful I'm long out of high school, as I can imagine a certain demographic of women that will start acting like her character in this movie. The problem is she's one of these characters that isn't really a character at at all. She isn't fleshed out enough to be fully three-dimensional, and is more so used as a MacGuffin to push the story forward, as there's a few times in the movie where the character needs to get out of the situation, and she's the only one that's able to solve the problem due to complete plot convenience. Like most of the main characters here, she's another example of being a comic relief, and nothing she says is really all that funny either. I feel bad for having this be so repetitive, but genuinely, this is how every character is in this movie. I'll start with mainly one of the very few positive I've had to say about this movie. I thought the production design and set design in this movie looked pretty decent. They opted to do some of these things practically, which I do respect a lot, and most of the time you can tell these sets are real, and they look good whenever they're on screen. It's an odd juxtaposition where it's time that breathes life into mainly such a lifeless movie. The story in this movie is the most basic, by-the-numbers sci-fi action flick we've seen done to death so many times before. It's incredibly formulaic and so tropey that, again, it almost falls in the line of being parody more than anything. The characters have to get from point A to point B through the convenience of a powerful MacGuffin that the villains in the movie also want to get in order to gain power. The villains of which in this movie, by the way, are extremely textbook standard one-dimensional villains that do nothing to actually act as genuine threat to the main cast. Their motives were boring, and their presence was just so forgettable. It really disappointed me that they took this movie in such a basic and boring direction when it could have been one of the more unique action films when you have all the lore of Borderlands and they just do nothing remotely interesting with it. The visual effects in this movie are indistinguishable to any other movie with CGI in it nowadays. They looked pretty bad for most of the movie. I think the only creatures that looked good in the movie were the psychos, because you could actually tell they were played by real people. In fairness to the movie, another effect that did look good was the visuals on Claptrap. The visual effects team did make an effort to make it look like he was actually there alongside the other characters in the movie, but outside of these two things, most of the visual effects here were pretty bad, but I don't think it's one of the worst looking movies of the year. I've definitely seen some movies this year that have had way worse effects, but I feel like in saying that, it's such a backhanded compliment to this movie itself, because the effects here just aren't all that good. I think this movie is further proof of how much of a hack Eli Roth is. While I really liked Thanksgiving, and personally have a soft spot for Hostel, I am under the impression that this guy is incredibly incompetent. There's no actual direction or artistic flair that gives this movie its own identity, and I think reading about what this movie could have been is more interesting than the movie we ended up getting. At one stage the movie was going to be R-rated, but they obviously didn't do this because the studio wanted more money, even though it's currently flopping at the box office. This movie is also partially directed by Tim Miller, who did the first Deadpool movie. He mainly came in to do reshoots, and is kind of telling considering how much of a mess this whole product is. Overall, I really didn't like this movie. On one hand, I do feel bad for disliking it, as I haven't fully engrossed myself in the world of the game, so I can't speak on just how accurate everything is in this movie or not. But if you're a Borderlands fan, and if you asked me about this movie, all I really have to say is I think fans of the games deserve so much better, and I'm sorry that this is what you have to deal with. I'm sorry your movie had to be helmed by such a hack in Hollywood. This could have been on track to be such a great video game movie, but alas, it is now doomed to live among many of the bottom of the barrel terrible video game movies. I'm giving Borderlands 2 stars. It's a poorly written, by the numbers, redundant and derivative sci-fi flick with some of the most abysmal humor I've seen in a long time, that so desperately wants to be the next big thing, yet doesn't realize in order to be that you first need to be a good movie, which this movie is not. There's some highlights in one or two performances, and some of the set design is impressive, but almost every other aspect of this movie falls flat and leaves a lot to be desired, as it has cemented itself to be part of the video game movie curse, which has brought on something that ultimately is barely watchable.